All right, this is Openstax U.S. History, Chapter 30, Section 4, Watergate, Nixon's Domestic Nightmare. So for everything that Richard Nixon actually did as president, from, ending the Vietnam War, creating the Environmental Protection Agency, opening up diplomatic relations with China, he will forever be remembered for the Watergate scandal and having been the first and so far only president to resign from office. The Watergate scandal involves the election of 1972, the Democratic candidate, George McGovern. Nixon successfully labeled him as the quote-unquote hippie candidate. He was anti-war, and he really just didn't gain a lot of traction with most American voters. Nixon created a new majority. This was really North and South voted for Nixon. And in the 1972 election, the re-election of Richard Nixon, it was a huge Nixon landslide. In fact, Nixon won more electoral votes than any other president really since Franklin Roosevelt during the New Deal. So this was a huge victory for Richard Nixon. However, it's around this election that the Watergate scandal is involved. So Nixon, more so than anything else, was, again, kind of like the master politician. He sought out to win elections, and he was good at it. He had people who worked for him called plumbers, and these plumbers used quote-unquote dirty tricks in order to get Richard Nixon elected. An organization called the Committee to Re-elect the President, or CREEP. Again, we could probably just kind of summarize these things. CREEP was a separate organization, but a lot of people who were involved in CREEP were plumbers who, again, kind of, went out and dug up dirt on Nixon's political opponents. Again, using kind of dirty political tricks in order to get Nixon elected. Daniel Ellsberg, the person who released the Pentagon Papers, top secret information about how both Johnson and Nixon had lied about the war in Vietnam, was one of these targets in which the plumbers went after, right, to go and dig up dirt on Daniel Ellsberg. People who were associated with, or these plumbers, those who were associated with the Committee to Re-elect the President, broke into the Watergate office/hotel. This was the headquarters, or a headquarters, of the Democratic Party, again, who Richard Nixon was running against in 1972. They were caught breaking into this hotel, placing wiretaps, among other things. Nixon was trying to figure out what the Democratic Party was trying to do so that he could more comfortably win re-election, which makes the whole Watergate scandal in its entirety all the more puzzling because Nixon won in a huge landslide. Essentially, he didn't need to cheat, but did so anyways. The FBI opened up an investigation into the people who broke into the Watergate Hotel, sometimes called the Watergate burglars. And the question was, does President Nixon know about this break-in? What role does the president have? President Nixon denied that he had anything to do with this break-in, when the reality was that, in fact, not only did he have something to do with it, he also tried to cover it up in the aftermath. The Washington Post obtained a top secret source of information known as Deep Throat. This was an FBI informant, which notified the newspaper of President Nixon's involvement, or at least the potential investigation into Nixon's involvement. And of course, the question was the White House connected to the Watergate break-in? Nixon continued to deny. The FBI continued to investigate. This sparked off the Watergate Crisis. The Watergate Committee was a congressional investigation into Nixon's role in the break-in. And during the investigation, the Watergate Committee brought up members of Nixon's administration and began questioning them, asking them what role did Richard Nixon have in this break-in? Was there a cover-up going on at the time? And as more and more people were brought in front of the committee, one of the persons who was being investigated let it slip that Richard Nixon recorded all of his phone conversations. And so the Watergate scandal then centered on what were called the Nixon tapes. The Nixon tapes were recorded phone conversations of the president. And this question about whether or not Nixon knew about the break-in would be answered once and for all if Congress could get a hold of those tapes. Now, why did Richard Nixon record his phone calls if he was doing shady political, tricks and covering up his own, his own criminal activity? Well, Nixon did that. He initially recorded his own phone conversations because he wanted to write a memoir after he was done, and he wanted to be able to listen to those phone calls while he wrote his book. It turned out that those tapes then became the central focus of the Watergate investigation. Richard Nixon claimed executive privilege and refused to turn over the tapes. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled in the U.S. v. Nixon that the president had to turn them over, had to turn the tapes over. Richard Nixon turned them over but deleted all the parts that had incriminated himself. That was not good enough. The Supreme Court continued to demand all the tapes being released. Meanwhile, Congress continued to demand that the tapes be released. And because Richard Nixon was not cooperating and obstructing justice, the United States Congress began drawing up articles of impeachment in order to remove Richard Nixon from office. The impeachment of Richard Nixon never actually happened because Richard Nixon, instead of being quote unquote fired, resigned, right? And this is the old saying, you can't fire me, right? I quit. And that's essentially what happened during the Watergate scandal. Richard Nixon became the first and only president to resign from office. Not only did the tapes reveal that Richard Nixon had some connection to the Watergate break-in, but in fact, even more incriminating was Richard Nixon's effort to try and cover it up, specifically the use of the CIA, or the Central Intelligence Agency, to try to interfere or mess up the FBI investigation to try and distance himself from any sort of wrongdoing. And so for all that Nixon did as president, forever this scandal characterizes Nixon's legacy from that point onwards. Richard Nixon was followed by Gerald Ford, who became the president after Richard Nixon resigned. Gerald Ford holds the distinction of being the only president to assume the office, which without ever having been on a presidential ticket. Richard Nixon's vice president, Spiro Agnew, also was forced to resign before the Watergate scandal. So Ford, who was the, so we have vice president here, we have President Nixon here. Ford, who was, I believe, Speaker of the House of Representatives, when Agnew resigned, Ford became the vice president, and when Nixon resigned, Ford then became the president. Gerald Ford gave a speech claiming our long national nightmare is over. That was, of course, referring to Watergate. In a very controversial move, Gerald Ford granted Nixon a full pardon, meaning that Nixon would not face criminal charges. One of the powers that executives have, whether that is the charges. One of the powers that the executive has, whether the president or governors of state, is to grant people pardons. That is to essentially absolve them from any sort of criminal investigation or prison time. So even though Nixon, resigned from the presidency, he may have still been subject to criminal charges, criminal wrongdoing. Ford pardoned that, and again, that was controversial. A lot of people believe that Nixon ought to, face the music, so to speak. But the most urgent crisis for Gerald Ford after getting over this long national nightmare, and the reason why Ford pardoned Nixon was because he wanted to put this all behind the United States and to have the country move on. So for better or for worse, that's what Ford's decision was. But besides Watergate, after that nightmare was over, the most pressing issue, of course, was the economy. It was still in a state of stagflation. Gerald Ford's policy for the economy was called win, whip inflation now. For the most part, it was not very effective in resolving the economic issues, and kind of the poor economy continued on into the 1970s. In terms of the Cold War, Gerald Ford signed the Helsinki Accord. So this is kind of like, we might call it an agreement with the Soviet Union. It really represented more than anything else kind of a better relationship between the two sides, kind of continuing the legacy of Richard Nixon in terms of deflating tensions between the Soviet Union and the United States.